Gary Haven and I, and along with L.A. Marsuli and Chase Kletsky, we also investigated during this 3-month shoot, we also investigated the elongated skulls of Paracas.
Okay.
And we did our own. My team, L.A. Marsuli, of course, did a phenomenal. L.A. and Chase. L.A. led this particular expedition, his own expedition, where they took samples of multiple elongated skulls, I think 50 plus, like 52 elongated skulls, and they were attempting to get nuclear DNA, which they were unable to get nuclear DNA because of the degradation of the skulls and how old they are.
Real quick, what's the significance of getting the nuclear DNA?
Well, the nuclear DNA tells you about the father.
Okay.
The mitochondrial DNA, which they were able to extract a lot of mitochondrial DNA and sequence a lot of mitochondrial DNA, that tells you about the mother.
Okay.
And you can learn a lot from it, but you have an incomplete picture. I was at LA's press conference in LA, in Los Angeles, and I was very intrigued. I thought he did a phenomenal job. So when I decided I was going to do my own investigation of the elongated skulls in Paracas and of the Paracas culture in general, I called LA and asked him if he would like to be part of that episode, and Chase Kletsky, because Chase had been instrumental in collecting the DNA. Again, she's a forensic investigator. She's trained in how to collect forensic and process forensic evidence, including DNA. So I called LA and Chase, invited them to come join me on our expedition in Paracas. And they came down and we were able to extract some more DNA, and we tested some samples from a skull in Paracas, and we were able to sequence some DNA, some mitochondrial DNA, with very interesting results. And that is also one of those episodes. So, we had a lot of adventures in Peru with our team, our expedition team, with L.A. Marsuli, Chase Kletsky, and then with Anselm P. Ramla and his sons. And so I've spent a lot of time, digging into these mysteries, and people, because I haven't really published any of this before, people don't know all the different things that I've been involved in the last 7 years. And this is all after I made the True Legends series with Steve Quayle. This is all happened in the aftermath of those documentary films, which many people have seen. So this is a completely different film project, TV series film project. So again, that's all available in the backstory over on my member site, thealberinoanalysis.com. Peru is one of the most fascinating places on planet Earth. And I don't know why it's a repository of all these mysteries and all these artifacts, but it is. And I know that according to the historical accounts, the bones of giants were found, definitively discovered in Peru after the conquest of the Inca Empire by both the conquistadors and by the official, they called them the visitadores, the official representatives of the Spanish crown, along with the representatives of the Holy See, of the Roman Catholic Church. And these things are well documented, but not many people know about it. So Peru is this absolutely mystical repository of strange artifacts. And of course, everyone's familiar now with these alleged alien mummies that have been featured widely on social media because of the work of Jaime Maussan primarily, who brought some of them, unbeknownst to the Peruvian government, was able to smuggle some of them out of Peru into Mexico, and did that press conference in the summer with the officials from the Mexican government. And I don't know if those mummies are real, the ones that Jaime has. I suspect that they are faked. However, I do suspect that there are some real ones in Peru. And in fact, the large one, I don't remember what they call that large one that's sort of in the fetal position sitting. That one is much larger than those little small mummies that Jaime has. I have a feeling that one might be real. I don't know. I've heard stories in Peru. I've been told in no uncertain terms by archaeologists, Spanish archaeologists who work in Peru, and by other people, a Spanish archaeologist who works in Peru, and by some other people who have intimate knowledge of of that mummy and the circumstances in which it was procured and where it was discovered originally. They have told me, and these people do not subscribe to ancient alien astronaut theory or anything like that. They've told me in secret, in private, that thing's real. So I don't know. I don't know. I've never been able to examine it myself. Certainly there are fakes. And I know you didn't ask me about any of this, but my brain is just switching from one topic to another as I'm.
It's all right. You go.
So I'm going to take a break here.
Sure.
For maybe going in directions you weren't planning on going in, but you get me telling stories about Peru, and it's going to be a long night.
That's quite all right.
Cigars involved.
Cigars and a good scotch for me. Well, I mean, I like the stream of thought and where it leads, because you have gotten to have all these adventures, and not a single thing is irrelevant. I mean, it's all relevant to that singularity moment. And I don't know if it was for you when you originally went over to Peru back when you were 18, if that suddenly sparked up that pursuit of adventure that you now seem to have really fully embraced, or what. But you've gotten to go on to do some pretty amazing things and make some pretty amazing discoveries. I mean, like you said, that are documented, that you have coming out here pretty shortly. And I guess to sort of shift things here, one of the big questions, of course, that people are going to raise when you start talking about Nephilim architecture, fallen angel technology, when you start talking about the giants of old, you talk about the men of renown. Of course, the question is, okay, well, where's the proof? And we could run down the rabbit hole on, the Smithsonian's been squirreling away giant skeletons for decades and decades and decades. That's where legends go to die, because of course they're going to come back and say, yeah, no, don't know what happened to it. Sorry, inconclusive on the DNA test here. It's just another weird looking tooth that you guys found. But we'll hang on to it. It'll never see the light of day again. So to that end, I've listened to you talk a little bit when you've gotten into the paint about your book Birthright, and when you were talking about that in conjunction with some of these structures that would have been built pre-flood, and even those structures themselves being sort of a testament as to them not being built by human hands, or if they were built by human hands, these are human hands that have some incredible and intense knowledge. One of the things you mentioned specifically was how these megalithic stones were cut and shaped. Could you go into a little bit about that?
Sure. I think it's important to note that the phrase that you're using, Nephilim architecture, fallen angel technology, that's a L.A. Marsouliism.
It is.
That is a phrase that he likes to use. Indeed, he coined that phrase. I understand the implication. I understand what the phrase is meant to convey, although I would probably disagree.
Okay.
What we're looking at is definitively Nephilim architecture or fallen angel technology, because that limits this technology to malevolent beings. When I think what we're looking at is just technology, and I don't ascribe good or evil attributes to inanimate objects or to technology or to knowledge in general.
Sure.
So I would say that in regard to who built the megaliths, not just in Peru, but all over the world, There's no way we can know that. The answer is nobody knows. That's the answer. We don't know who built the megaliths. We can theorize about potential candidates who might have been able to build the megaliths, and certainly within this suite of candidates, of available candidates, we have giants, the Nephilim,
the elder race, even,
and also their, according to ancient Hebrew lore, their extraterrestrial fathers, the Watchers. Now, even if the megaliths were constructed by the giants or by the Watchers themselves, that does not mean that what we're looking at is some kind of evil technology or evil architecture.
Neutral.
Because these are inanimate objects. These are walls made of stone. These are techniques and represent architectural knowledge, right? So it's just as plausible that the quote unquote good guys could have devised these walls as the bad guys. So it is unknowable, really, who could have built such magnificent mammoth constructions of some of the hardest stone on earth.
Mm-hmm.
And not just, again, in Peru, but all over the world. Every continent has megaliths.
Sure. It's interesting conjecture there on the, I mean, not to disagree with you, but interesting conjecture on not just that these are essentially neutral or benign structures, but that they could be built by good guys or bad guys, when, you know, according to the accounts that we have inside the Bible and then in the book of Enoch, we understand the Nephilim to have been a damned creation, something that should not have come into existence, nefarious from the get-go. I don't know if you're familiar with Gary Wayne's book, The Genesis 6 Conspiracy. He talks about inside there, during Noah's time spent building the ark, about him potentially witnessing to the Nephilim and them possibly even having potential for redemption themselves, but choosing to stay within their own iniquitous action. So for me, again, and not to like try and just blatantly disagree with you, but I have to wonder if a lot of these structures weren't made with nefarious intent, even though, again, they are just simply structures. Some of them, L.A. Marzulli has talked of as though they might have been some sort of machine, like these little nodules. What are those for? What could those have been used in conjunction with? Potentially.
Well, again, all we can do is speculate.
Yes,
formulate conjectures. That's it. Hypotheses. And one hypothesis is just as good as another when you don't have any idea whatsoever who the builders actually were.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, we need to also factor into this equation this elongated skull race.
Mm-hmm.
The Paracas culture, and the Paracas culture were not the only civilization, the only culture to engage in the elongation of the skull or to have elongated skulls. There were other cultures around the world that where the elongated skull features prominently, such as Egypt.
Mm-hmm.
But prominently in regard to certain important individuals appear to have had elongated skulls, not necessarily that it was predominant. It certainly wasn't predominant trait in Egypt. It was apparently a very common trait among the Paracas people. Now, there certainly are plenty of Paracas elongated skulls, which are the product of cradle headboarding,
Mm-hmm.
of cranial deformation. Absolutely. But there are some, which I am absolutely convinced are the result of a genetic variation, of a genetic anomaly, a subspecies, in fact, of a subspecies from the human species. So, in other words, a non-human or hybridized species. Now, that, of course, is a wild wild statement. The implications of that statement are magnitudinous, let's say.
Mm-hmm.
But nevertheless, I make it with boldness because I have seen entire mummies intact. So I'm not just looking at a cranium without flesh. I'm looking at mummies. And by the way, one of these mummies is featured in one of those films.
Wink, wink, nudge, nudge, folks, get on it.
It's one of the most astounding things I've ever seen in my life. It's one of the most bizarre things I've ever seen in my life. This mummy, because it had all of its flesh on it, was extremely well preserved. One of the first mummies actually discovered by the eminent archaeologist Julio Tejo, who was really the first to explore and perhaps even discover the Paracas culture in Peru. And it was apparent to me, looking at this mummy, that this thing is not entirely human. I felt like I was looking at a subspecies of Homo sapien. Just the way the neck was connected to the cranium, the sheer size of this cranium, even the shape of the body was all very bizarre. And so I am absolutely, thoroughly convinced that some of the elongated skulls, of the Paracas elongated skulls, are the result of a genetic variation, as I said before, i.e., a non-human species, a variation in the human genome that is the result of natural forces and not artificial cranial deformation. So those guys have to be factored into this equation as well. What does it mean if you have a larger cranium? It should be noted that the Paracas culture, these elongated skull individuals, they're not large, they're not big. You know, online, if you type in Paracas elongated skulls, you get all kinds of weird stuff. And if you look at the images on Google Images, you get the impression that you're looking at really large beings because their skulls are so they're so misshapen and strange looking. You feel like you get the impression, the way that some people crop these photos, when in fact these were very diminutive people. These are more like elves or dwarves or gnomes or something like that. These are very diminutive people. They're very small, unusually small, in fact.
Makes you wonder about the Greys.
Well, that's a whole nother. That's a whole nother digression. But the Paracas culture, there's a number of things about them that make them exceedingly bizarre. For one thing, you can't just think about how large the head is. You have to think about the cranial capacity for the brain. You have to think about what kind of brain is going to fill that void, because it's not going to be empty. A larger cranium, if it's genetic, means a larger brain, perhaps a completely different kind of brain. And so are we dealing with perhaps a subspecies of Homo sapien that had certain qualities that are superior to the human species in regard to computation, in regard to calculations of mathematical calculations, perhaps relating to architecture, perhaps relating to chemistry, perhaps relating to science in general. In other words,
maybe.
In other words, were these elongated skull entities superior in regard to their intellect? Were they intellectually superior to Homo sapien? And I happen to believe that what we're looking at here is a very ancient race of non-Homo sapiens, or perhaps even hybridized Homo sapiens. And And does that relate? How does that relate to, for example, the Nephilim? Well, maybe it doesn't at all. Maybe it does. The problem is the identifying attribute of the Nephilim is the fact that they were gigantic, right? Nephilim is synonymous with giant.
Yeah, I suppose that would be the physical aspect that we see described in the Bible, them being as tall as cedars.
Well, the Nephilim were giants, so that's apparent. They're always described as giants, both in the Old Testament and rather both pre-flood and post-flood, in an antediluvian and post-diluvian context. They're described as giants.
Mm-hmm.
So these are not giants. These, as I said, are more like gnomes. By the way, their orbital sockets are extremely large. They're unusually large, which means they had really big eyeballs.
Mm-hmm.
And we discovered while we were there, this is something that Julio Tejo actually wrote about, that they had the strange inclination to dwell under the ground. And in fact, we explored, again, in the films, we explored the underground, the subterranean dwellings of the Paracas people, which are very little is known. I mean, the public knows very little about this. Everyone knows that the Paracas skulls are, these elongated skulls, and are they aliens? Mm-hmm. Is it cradle headboarding? But very few people realize that these guys were dwelling under the ground. They were subterranean species.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you might say that.
I'm having a thought real quick.
They had dwellings above the ground, by the way, for those who are wondering. Yes, they did. They had they built complexes and indeed pyramids, step pyramids out of large adobe blocks. But much of their dwellings were apparently subterranean, and this comes from Julio Tejo, and we were able to go and visit these locations in the Paracas Desert and indeed fly our radar over them.